On today's episode of May the Record Reflect.
We talked about that human trafficking case with Vinnie Brooks, and in opening, I talked about going into a world of human prostitution, of human trafficking. And I said, you're not going to like the witnesses. You're just not going to like them. You're going to hear from a young woman who did things that will not make sense to you. And she has prior felony convictions. And I just painted her as a miserable human being. My instinct was to apologize for her. But a very senior, very seasoned, trial attorney, my partner in that case told me, she's like, no, don't do it. She's got to own it and you've got to eat it. And so in opening, I undersold the government's case. And I'd listened to her. I'd listened to Vinnie, and I knew she was going to be incredible. There's a part of me that's like, yeah, she's got some problems, but wait until you hear this, folks. Not the approach. The approach is that she is just a broken human being that has done some horrible things. You're going to believe her because of the corroboration. And people are like, oh gosh, what is the government doing? Like, this sounds like a terrible case if it's totally relying on her. But then they hear her and they see the corroboration. And they're like, I don't even care about the corroboration. She was so good.
That was Mike Beckwith, and this is May the Record Reflect. Hello and welcome to the monthly podcast of the National Institute for Trial Advocacy. I'm your host, Marcy Mangan, and in today's episode, I'll be sharing trial tips on the core 4 competencies of opening statement, direct examination, cross-examination, and closing argument from our archives. A couple months ago, NITA Studio 71 producer Charlie Woodcock and I had the chance to revisit the archives of May the Record Reflect while we worked together on creating NITA's podcast channel on YouTube. For me, it was a fun look back at our earliest episodes and the truly phenomenal trial lawyers we have here in NITA's orbit. So with the podcast now on YouTube, I thought it was kind of a nice opportunity to resurface some of our oldies but goodies from a few years ago. Every trial lawyer needs to know about what we sometimes call the core 4, those 4 skills that are essential to trial. Brooke Lotta opens with her tips and reflections on opening statements from episode 46. Brooke is an assistant United States attorney for the Southern District of Florida. In her role as a prosecutor for the Department of Justice, she prosecutes a variety of federal offenses, including human trafficking, drug trafficking, armed robberies, border offenses, fraud, and crimes against children. Prior to joining the U.S. Attorney's Office, she was an assistant general counsel with the Broward Sheriff's Office, training law enforcement officers on legal issues. She was also an assistant state attorney for the 17th Judicial District. Getting back to the episode, here is what Brooke had to say about her favorite part of trial, the opening statement. I am a writer myself, and I'm always interested in hearing about how other writers start a writing project. And so I would love to hear about how you begin this new project of creating your opening statement. What does that actually look like for you, and how do you do it?
So many different people have different styles, and I'm probably going to shock you to tell you this, but I don't write out my opening statements, and a lot of people do. So what my craft would look like would be this. I have my roadmap of how I want it to look on paper. Then I take that roadmap and I put headlines for the different chapters that I want to talk about with my jurors. So, for example, my first headline when I'm writing out my opening might be something like my grabber. Is it going to be a quote? Is it going to be a personal story? Is it going to be a defendant's admission, one of his statements? And then under that headline, I'm going to draft the bullet points that support it. Then I'm going to move to my next headline, and my next headline might say, all right, Brooke, tell the story. Then I'm going to, under that headline, put another bullet point, and another bullet point of the different areas that I want to cover under that story subsection. And I do that because while some folks like to write everything out top to bottom, right, start to finish, every single word, I find that when I did that, when I first started practicing, what was happening is I would put it to memory and then I would mess up in front of the jurors and I would get a word wrong and they would sense it and they'd feel it. And it was so mechanic and robotic. And when I started to switch to the bullet points with my headlines, I found that I was being a lot more conversational. So that's how I put that to writing. And that's what that sheet of paper is going to look like. It's going to have my sections, my chapters. It's going to have some quick notes under each chapter of the different things that I want to hit and that I want to talk about. And I'm going to play with that thing up until the morning that I give my opening. And it's going to be tweaked and it's going to be edited. And I will never give the same opening based on that sheet of paper more than once. It will always change in some very small way every time.
So yeah, that's interesting. You really are just outlining it and then making sure that you've got something that's easy to commit to memory rather than trying to be like an actor and memorizing all of your lines. How do you like to workshop it? You said that when you work on it and you're refining it, you tell a different opening every single time. So who gets to hear it and who are you working with and all of that?
I don't typically practice it in front of other people. I only practice it with myself. And I know there's a bunch of schools of thoughts on that, but here's why. What I'll do is I'll play it over in my mind multiple times throughout the day, whether I'm driving to work, whether I'm coming back from work, whether I'm in the shower. I'll play it with a little bit of music in the background and I'll just recite it to myself in my head. The only time I will ever perform it in front of somebody other than the jurors is this. And it's not a performance and it's not formal and it's not like I'm ready to go. I will sit with a friend and I'll sit them down in a chair and I'll say, let me explain to you very calmly and informally what this case is about. And I'll just talk out my opening and I'll make sure that they don't have questions about the things that I'm talking about. I'll make sure that they like the things I'm talking about. At the end of it, I'll get some feedback of areas that I can tweak and work on and fix and correct. And then what I do is for the very first time in front of the jurors, they're seeing the only time that I am enunciating my words, showing a little bit of emotion, being a little bit theatrical in a non-theatrical way. And they're the first people that get to see the full performance. And I find that in doing that, it's more natural. And like we talked about earlier, it's less robotic and it's less rehearsed. And when we show jurors that we're not rehearsed, it shows that we're just being more natural.
So have you ever had a case where you have struggled to come up with how to open how to open your case, how to make your opening statement, how to tell the right story and get off on the right foot? How do you get over that? Where do you find inspiration?
That's when you kind of put like little focus groups out with friends. And I'll throw something catchy out, a different a phrase. Some of the cases that I've worked on, if it's a fraud related case, I'll bounce around different ideas and I'll come up with the concept of, okay, the defendant had a factory of fraud, and then I'll say that to friends and then friends get really excited about it and they're like, I love it.
I like it too.
And then yeah, it's catchy, right? It's simple, it's short, it's concise. Sometimes I'll bounce ideas around and say, hey, listen, what do you think about this term or this phrase? And then friends and coworkers will say, it's not going to happen. Sometimes I'll steal ideas from other people, from movies, from things off the internet. I think that's really what makes a great opening is just good stuff from other people that have show that it can work and incorporating it and making it your own and putting your own spin on it. So that I find that's been pretty helpful to me.
Yeah, it kind of it's like a shortcut because the jurors know that story and it gives them something to hang your narrative on.
Right. And they remember it, they remember those different catchy things.
Yeah, great point. So, in terms of media and entertainment nowadays, we've just become an increasingly visual society. I was thinking about how my grandparents would gather around a radio to listen to the news or to serial stories. And of course, FDR had his fireside chats during the Second World War. And so that's all auditory. And opening statements are a bit more like that. They're mostly an auditory experience that demands that jurors really pay attention and use their imagination. So, in a visual society, how do you engage the imagination of these, I guess you call them visual consumers in this day and age, and then hold their attention throughout your opening?
So that's a great point, and it's really hard to do because jurors get bored. And we don't get bored of ourselves because we love to talk and we like the attention, but jurors get bored of us and they want us to speed it up. And what I have found that has worked are a few things. First, something I always do is I talk to jurors like they are a friend that I'm having a martini with and I'm sitting across the table from. And I'm just talking to that friend about something that's a very serious, very important issue. And I'm keeping it simple. I'm keeping it concise. So it's a serious tone, but it's casual. Something else that I try to do is a little bit of theater is involved, a little bit of acting. Like any good movie, we're captivated by people that move with purpose. So I try to do that in my openings. We're captivated by actors that can get emotional or can get passionate about something. So that keeps our attention. We're passionate about movies or actors that change their tone. That's gone a long way. I found that if I'm really trying to emphasize a point to the jurors, I'll slow down and I will say one or two words very quietly, and they'll lean in a bit more, and they'll really want to know what I'm saying at that point. So a little bit of acting goes a long way. I also try to keep it really simple. And there's things that I don't do that I see a lot of other people do that don't work. I don't thank my jurors. Jurors don't want to be thanked. I don't introduce myself in openings. The judge has already introduced me. I've already spoken with them in jury selection for an hour. They want me to get right to it in an opening, so I don't need to say my name again or who I represent. They know that. I also don't thank them for their service in terms of talking about how serious this is and why the jury system is so important, because again, jurors just want to get to it. So the things that you don't do really help and support the things that you do, and that's gone a long way.
Those are great points. So, what are your thoughts on using visual aids during openings?
If this were on a video recording, you would see me hold up a sign that says 100%. I am 100% using visual aids in my opening statement. Jurors get bored easily and they want to look at something. And when you throw in a visual aid, that's a simple aid to follow. That's an aid where your words are going to provide context to it. Now they're both looking and they're listening. And I keep my aids ultra easy and simple. For example, if I'm doing a trial involving a dangerous weapon or a dangerous weapon being used, I might just walk up with the weapon and just let it sit there and talk about what that weapon did to somebody. I tried a case one time that involved a woman throwing bleach on a baby that severely burned the child. And in my opening, I walked up and I had the bleach bottle and I just sat it on the podium and I let it sit there for a couple seconds. And then I explained why that bleach bottle is going to be instrumental in this case and why they're looking at something like that and what that means and what that did. So if you keep it simple and it's self-explanatory, it goes a long way for the jurors.
Well, those are visuals that certainly have impact. Do you ever need to get clearance from the court before you use those in your opening?
Yes. Yes. And you should. And there are some jurisdictions where you need to get clearance and some jurisdictions where you don't need to get that clearance. But here's why I, as a matter of practice, always get it. One, I always share it with the defense ahead of time and I say, listen, this is what I'm going to be showing in my opening. Do you have an objection? Even if the defense or that opposing counsel says, no, I don't have an objection, I'm still bringing it to the attention of the court. And I tell the judge, I'll say, Judge, for the court's awareness, I plan on introducing this, or rather showing it during my opening. I showed it to opposing counsel. They don't object. And I just wanted the court to be aware. And I'm going to do that because, most importantly, I don't want my opening being interrupted. And if I don't show opposing counsel and I don't explain it to the judge, both of them or one of them, or maybe none, may jump up in my opening and say, Ms. Latta, what are you doing? Or the defense says, I'm going to object. And now what has happened is I've taken my internally rehearsed opening and that beautiful, powerful moment that I have with this visual aid and that aha moment. And now it's ruined because there's an objection, there's an interruption, and my opening is paused. And you're going to lose it all from there. So I typically always let the court know what's happening. I always let the defense know what's happening. And that way I'm giving an interruption-free opening.
I think that is excellent advice. And it actually leads really well to my next question, which is whether you should ever object during opening your opposing counsel's opening, and what is at stake if you do.
Yeah, that's tough. That's tough. Unless it is something that is so objectionable, that is so offensive, to the proceedings. I don't object. I don't involve myself in opposing counsel's opening. And I don't do that because if I object, let's say to argumentative during opening, what's going to happen is the judge, 99.9% of the time, will overrule me. And if they overrule me, or even if they sustain the objection, what the jurors now are doing is that they are now awake because it's the first objection in the trial. They're excited about an objection because they want to know what it is and what it's about. And now they're really listening to the next few words, whether it's overruled or sustained. They're listening to the next few words out of my opposing counsel's mouth. And now I've just given them even more attention and I've given them the floor more. So I stay as far away from objecting as possible. I'm polite. I sit back. I don't make a highlight of anything in their openings during their opening. And then in closing, I might attack some of their things that they said.
Now we have Mike Beckwith on direct examination. Prior to joining Dickinson Wright in Silicon Valley, Mike served as a chief of transnational organized crime in the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of California. In that role, he led a unit of AUSAs dedicated to conducting complex, multi-jurisdictional investigations with both national and international implications. He has litigated hundreds of cases in federal trial courts throughout his career, so he knows a thing or two about examining witnesses. From episode 26, here are a few of Mike's thoughts on direct examination. Cases are won on direct examination. Do you agree or you disagree?
I would agree. I think that the direct is what builds your case, and this is true for a prosecution and for any case that a plaintiffs bring. I think there's a strong correlation between probably criminal practice and plaintiff's work, and in that you're both attempting to prove elements and establish elements and improve a case. And so the direct is what's setting up that case. All the directs that you have the burden of proof, and all the directs set up that case. It sets up your closing. Your opening looks to what you expect the evidence in the case will show. And then your rebuttal is a chance to highlight what you've drawn out on. on direct. So yeah, I think it's the foundation, and it is certainly for the case, and these are the tools and the pieces of evidence that you use in each of your arguments that you'll eventually make to the jury.
So when you and I were negotiating this episode a couple of weeks ago, you remarked to me that you think that direct is actually harder than it seems. Cross-examination is really the one that makes people nervous and all angsty, but direct, not so much. So what do you think makes it so challenging?
Sure, it's a great question. I think it's the preparation that goes into it, because every witness is going to be different. And a lot of your direct is based on the strengths and the weaknesses of your witnesses. And so, I mean, just from I think about, putting a trial together, the amount of time that I would spend putting a direct together compared to even the cross-examination of the defendant in the case, it is probably more time spent on the direct. We relatively recently did a tax case in which the lawyer was just failing to pay his taxes on the $3.5 million that he was bringing in every year. And I spent a fair amount of time preparing a cross, but I spent so much more time on the witnesses certainly preparing his accountants for their direct examinations. And so I think what makes it harder is the management of witnesses and the time. You've got to decide what to leave in and what to leave out. On cross in general, you're in, you're out, you're going to make your points. You get up on your soapbox, you hop off. It is much more, in some ways, it's much more surgical in nature. I know with a witness, in general, I'm going to try to get 3 or 4 points out on cross. Now, with a defendant in particular, sometimes you can run your entire case through that defendant on cross. But if you've done a good job on direct, you may not need it. And so I think much of the cross is about the lawyer, whereas direct is much more about the witness. And so it's less controlled, and it's harder to actually prepare for. If you've got a great witness, if you've got an agent that's been around for 20 years, let's say an IRS agent or a DE agent, you can kind of do the what happened next, and then what happened, and what happened after that. That's fine. But the prep that goes into that point, getting to that point, is not it's not insignificant. And especially if you have civilian witnesses, in that tax case that I mentioned, we had CPAs who had kind of moved quickly through doing the taxes for this lawyer, and I think they were a little embarrassed to be up on the stand, and so they were not going to give me what I was looking for. They had their own agenda, and you've got to work through prepping them. I mean, what they saw was truth, and you got to get that out of them, but they want to shade it in their own way, and so sometimes you're working against your own witness. I think it's the preparation that takes time, and more so if the witness is disagreeable.
Yeah, it seems like a challenge to try to control the flow of information that is presented to the jury when so much of it is out of your hands.
And one of the things that we'll always do is talk about with a witness on direct, be they a very experienced federal agent or a civilian, it's deliberate in small chunks. And so, 2 or 3 sentences with each answer.
Direct is often thought to be the part of the trial that has the least drama or interest that would compel a juror's close attention. And especially if the examination happens to be with an expert witness, because you have to introduce them and qualify them as experts. And it almost can be a little bit like an audio version of their CV. So how can you keep direct examination from being boring?
Sure. I think you've got to make it about the witness. And I do think jurors are very interested in I think, a lot of times we'll get initially, hesitance. What am I doing here? But once they've committed, once they've been sworn in, I think they are great Americans who are just trying to do their job, and they want to listen. The more we can make this about the witness and less about the lawyer, the better. And so with the CV, with the expert, oftentimes we want to humanize that person. We just had a pharmaceutical, well, it's called a diversion case, a trial in which a doctor was prescribing opioids outside of the standard of care. We have an expert that gets up there and is going to tell you what the standard of care is. And it almost becomes a battle of the experts, which in a criminal case is never a good thing for us. But humanizing him, getting him to slow down in his delivery. And so part of it is the prep, and then kind of walking through, why'd you become a doctor? Why, where did you go to med school? How'd you make that choice? And so infusing some, I think, humanity in that CV. So, you went to Harvard for med school. That's great. Why did you go there? Seems like you could have gone anywhere. Invariably, you're going to get something out, and you're going to start to tell the story of this person, and the jurors are going to start to relate. Now, hopefully you have an interesting witness, and you've chosen your expert, appropriately.
The case that you mentioned, the opioid case, of course, it's in the news all the time. But a lot of Americans also, unfortunately, have had their family lives touched by that, by overdoses and drug abuse and the crisis. And so that can pull them in too. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, and anything that you think will bring or pique the jurors' attention. And then I think that's critical.
So it's one thing to establish rapport by breaking the ice and creating this conversation with your witness and helping the jurors identify with them and to connect with them. And that's a skill that we all need to have in our interpersonal relationships. So it's not just lawyers. But sometimes the witness who is on the stand, who is someone that you're counting on to help you with your case and to help you with your client, has done really terrible things in their lives. And I know that you've prosecuted drug trafficking cases, sex trafficking, violent crimes, armed robbery, and all of that kind of stuff. So you have some experience with this. How do you humanize kind of a despicable human being who also happens to be your witness?
Everyone has a story to tell. And in most cases, there's a reason for why they did, these despicable things.
Mm-hmm.
In that tax case, it was actually harder to bring the jurors around to our CPAs because they were just so defensive.
Oh,
but in a murder, it was next to impossible. And talking to the jurors afterwards, they did not like those witnesses.
Huh.
But we've had cases in which you'll put a murderer on the stand, and they're going to explain why they did what they did, and not in the same. I mean, we would never put a kind of a cold-blooded murderer on the stand in the sense that like home invasion type thing. But in the gang context, there is sometimes there's a story that can be told, and that person, as long as they own it, as long as they are telling the truth, and as long as you can corroborate what they're saying, I actually would rather have a violent criminal on the stand than a white collar person who's trying to squirm out of it. And so these CPAs were very difficult. I had, in the past, one of the most compelling witnesses I've actually ever seen was a woman who worked for a human trafficker. And she, without getting into too much, I mean, it'll take forever to explain the whole setup, but she would work these young girls, underage girls, in Vegas while the boss, the pimp, was in Sacramento. And so this is called going on automatic. And she would take these girls around and she would prostitute them on behalf of the pimp, who was incredibly violent and a very dangerous human being. And so Vinnie Brooks had a story to tell. And that is one of abuse, and that is one of personal degradation. And but when she got up there and owned it,
that was compelling.
I mean, she tells her story. She tells why she did it, and she says and basically tells the jury that I'm sorry. I mean, she was amazing.
So let them tell their story and be honest.
I think so. Absolutely. And really for us, for the prosecutor at that point, for any lawyer at that point, you're just a disembodied voice. I mean, if the vision that I always think of is a disembodied voice in a dark room, and I'm just asking the next question, and I want all the attention to be on that witness. Be that person despicable, be that person, a federal agent who is, who worked on 9/11 down in, Southern Manhattan. And you're going to see this ping pong. You're going to see this heads going back and forth. You just wait for the next question, and then the jury's head will focus on and listen to that witness.
You've worked on some really interesting, high-profile, kind of scary cases. Do you feel like your life has ever been threatened or in danger because of the work that you've done? Do I just watch too much TV?
No. I don't. I mean, very early on, I had a very experienced defense attorney standing at the podium with me. And usually in federal court, it's a bigger courtroom, and so there's two podiums. But for some reason, this judge had one, and we're sentencing this guy, and I'm right next to him, and this very seasoned, very experienced defense attorney sees me grabbing my pen, and as in a way that I can defend myself if I have to. And he's
defensive mode, yeah.
Right. And he's like, whatever, Mike. He's like, you are so far down the list. First, actually, is that guy up there who's sentencing him. The judge needs protection. I'm next because I didn't represent him very well. You're just a cog. And I was like, that makes total sense. And, so no, my wife and I both do this. That is not a conversation that we have. And there have been, cartel members, there have been human traffickers, there have been very violent people. In some cases, they're not the ones that are worried because they know the system. It's some of these white collar guys that lose it.
Interesting.
They're a little more worrisome to the U.S. Marshals, but we're not. Just not a part of our life that we're concerned about.
Good. I'm glad I just suffer from an excessive imagination then.
Judge Hanley spent the first 15 years of her career as an assistant attorney general and first assistant county attorney in Kansas, leading high-level crime prosecutions in cases involving crimes against women, crimes against children, and digital crimes. Since 2016, she has served as a district court judge in Lawrence, Kansas, and is the program director of our annual NITA Women in Trial program, which will be held in Kansas City this September. Judge Hanley was joined in conversation by Professor Cheryl Whatley. Professor Whatley is an inaugural faculty member of the UNT Dallas College of Law. She began her career I'm sensing a theme here, as an assistant United States attorney in Connecticut, where she represented the United States in civil litigation. She later transferred to the USA's office for the Northern District of Texas, where she served as chief of the Economic Crime Unit. Professor Whatley is the author of the NITA case file, Marine Rescue Specialists v. Riverboat Queen. Now, let's listen in on Professor Whatley's conversation on cross-examination with Judge Hanley, which was actually part of a larger discussion on what they called the tense trio: objections, cross-examination, and impeachment. Everyone hopes to end their cross with a flourish, with a great zinger. It's another of those cinematic moments that trial lawyers dream of. So what exactly are the fundamentals of the zinger? If I could start with you, Judge Hanley.
Well, first, I better warn everybody that it's not always going to happen. I sure wish I could tell you that I ended at least half of my cross-examinations with the zinger, but that's probably not true. In my opinion, there's two ways to actually get the zinger. Usually the best one is to listen for it, right? The witness actually says something great, and then you have to end right there. You have to have the confidence to end that cross-examination and sit down because it was so good, it just made your case and you're done. You got the zinger, but you had to leave off a few questions. And that's hard for lawyers because we have more things we want to say. So listen for it and end there. The other way that you can get a zinger perhaps is to plan it, but that takes you coming up with a really important point about your case and then making sure that you can place it at the end of the cross-examination and it reinforces your theory. And you have to kind of save that and making sure that it's not something that they can stand right back up and rehabilitate on. So that's a more difficult call. They're always better when it happens in the moment, and then you have the confidence to sit down after you hear it.
I think it's when you have a question, I call them the no-lose questions, that when the answer is one that the witness does not want to answer, and that becomes obvious to everyone. And I agree with Judge Hanley that sometimes you get that in preparation. Sometimes that will say, okay, he has said this, he's this, I can prove it's a lie, I can show it, and so I'm going to, display for everyone, demonstrate to everyone how not believable this witness is. But sometimes, and this is where I'm not as gifted as Judge Hanley, because I have to take notes. So if I can use their words back to them, and particularly, and we're going to talk about impeachment in a moment, but if I can quote them and I can make them disavow what they said on direct and make them admit that's so. I call it the drop the mic moment. That's when you just want to close your book, stand there, say everybody got that point. Okay, now we're done. Can we go directly to the verdict form?
Yeah, if you get that impeachment moment, I completely agree. That's enough. Done. Mic drop for sure. This is another high conflict area, and the thing that most lawyers tense up about is controlling the witness. So I always make the comparison to herding cats because I have cats. So it is literally the same kind of thing when you are trying to control a witness.
I think one of the reasons that lawyers might get tense about cross-examination is because they don't really know what to do. They've just heard this testimony from the witness, and if it's not a civil case and then they haven't had the opportunity for a full deposition, it's like, what do I focus on? And so again, I think preparation helps ease that tension because okay, these are the points that I need to address, or here's how the witness can actually has good information for me. But if you're sitting there and just for the first time hearing the witness, it is naturally tense because you're figuring out, what do I do now? How do I respond? So it's critical that the lawyer prepare in advance so that you can you make it easier for yourself. You give yourself a prop every time you prepare.
Cross has the potential to be that cinematic moment that really makes you feel like a trial lawyer, but certainly not at the very beginning of your career. Cheryl, can you tell me how many trials you think it took for you to get to that point where you had that cinematic moment?
Well, I wanted a Perry Mason moment when I was trying to get this bank robber to confess that she was the lady on the videotape robbing the bank. And the judge finally pulled me aside and said, you do realize that's only TV, that does not happen in real life. But I think when you become comfortable with controlling someone, and I think the judge's point on that is well taken, then you learn how to say, look, this is the story I want you to tell. I'm going to say the facts and you're going to say yes, and together we will walk down this path. But that's not what we tell people to do as natural interaction. So once you get comfortable with being kind of, I am going to dictate and you're going to agree. Unfortunately, I think my nature was a little bit more comfortable with that. I'm very bossy and I love to tell people what to do. And so it came more quickly, I think, than it does for most well-mannered lawyers. But it is a function of, look, I'm telling you how it happened and you're going to say yes.
For me, it was at least a couple dozen trials before I really felt like I was satisfied with my level of cross-examination. Now think about that. I mean, 24 trials is a substantial number. A lot of attorneys won't ever do 24 trials, but that's the truth as far as my comfort level. It could also have been my background. I'm a prosecutor. We do more direct than we did cross-examination, but a couple of dozen, and it takes you a little bit to get to that comfort level because you need to learn the method. And that's what got me there, was learning the method, right? The leading questions, short questions, using head notes. Once I learned the method, then I was prepared, more prepared to deal with whatever control issues that particular witness might have.
Judge Hanley, could you complete this sentence for me? Cross is X% preparation and Y% spur of the moment.
25% prep and 75% spur of the moment. And I go back to my comments about the method, because you can prepare, you can make sure that you're organized and you know the topic areas that you want to cover, and you have the order that you're going to cover those things, but you're always going to have to adjust in the moment, and you're going to have to control that witness, and you won't know exactly how that's going to play out until the witness is in front of you. But the method, the leading questions, keeping them short, and different witness control techniques that you add to your quiver over time, that's what gives you the method that you can rely on for that 75% spur of the moment.
Cheryl, would you say that the ratio is about the same for you or different?
You know, my experience has been that it's different. And the reason I say that is I firmly have learned that preparation makes me able to tackle things that are sometimes even the unexpected. And so, again, preparation, even with identifying the issues and then literally writing out the questions. So you can see, I call them the yellow brick road. And so that I can say, okay, this is a yellow brick, it's going to take me. And so I can move my bricks around if I need to. But I have in my mind how I want it to go and what those steps are that are going to take me. Now, invariably, there's going to be something that's happened in the courtroom that's going to change my plan, right? There's going to be something that is the spur of the moment. But I will tell you, the thing that frightens me most is when I have someone on direct and I've listened to them and I think I've got gotcha, that you've stepped into some kind of trap, and I'm going to be able to use it as a gotcha moment on cross-examination. And I may not have thought it all the way through. And I get caught up in the spur of the moment. And all of a sudden you're trying to backpedal. You're trying to say, oh, I've got to salvage it. So I'm really afraid of the spur of the moment because it can end up backfiring on you. But I do think you've got to be able to pivot. You've got to be able to anticipate or deal with that which you have not anticipated.
Next question is about getting out of your own way during cross. We've said that cross is one of those tense trio items, and I'd like to know, what is the psychological hurdle that needs to be overcome here? Cheryl, start with you.
You know, I think that if you are afraid you're being too aggressive, then you are going to restrict yourself. And you're not going to develop a comfort level in asking the questions. And so I think it's particularly incumbent to be comfortable with where you want to go, and then you'll be able to figure out how to get there. If you actually approach it almost conversational with the witness, although you're telling, rather than letting them participate in the conversation, you're going to make your points. You know what you want, where you want to go. You know, and then the other hand, it could be you like the confrontation, right? Sometimes you have to get out of your own way in terms of you're enjoying it too much. You're being too aggressive. You're being too insistent, you know, that repeated, but didn't you say, and didn't you say, like the proverbial dog with the bone, and you just don't let it go. You've got to know how to read all of those things and to identify the moment of, I've made my point, I've achieved my objective, I can move on.
I agree that we can get way too caught up in thinking about tone and demeanor on cross as if that's the whole ball of wax. And it's not at all. It's about the facts, it's about your questions. Think of, being very workmanlike in cross instead of the scene from A Few Good Men, because that's not what a good cross examination looks like. So that's what we think about. We think about our tone and our demeanor, and we can get caught up in that instead of preparing with the questions and the points that we want to make. But in addition to a psychological hurdle, I have discovered that there's also a physical hurdle to cross-examination and that tone and demeanor. And what I'm talking about there is that adrenaline rush that we get from confrontation. And if you've been in trial and you've done cross-examination, you know what I'm talking about. The blood is pumping, the energy is coursing through you. And I've heard communications specialists talk about this and how we really need to burn off some of that excess energy. And one of the best suggestions I heard, or maybe it was a story of something she tried, was going into the bathroom and doing wall push-ups. And I always tell people that I wear high heels in trial, and try doing 2 flights of stairs in those. That'll burn off some energy for you and take the adrenaline down to a manageable level, because then you're normalized. Then you are more relaxed, and you're not going to be as affected by that as far as your delivery for your cross-examination, and it's going to be much more effective.
If I might just piggyback on that, if you're not able to leave the courtroom, if you're not able to run up the flights of stairs, I always think, tactically, take a couple of seconds to get your papers together. Make it look like, you need to organize things. Give yourself 20, 30 seconds before you either start asking questions or go to the podium if you're in a courtroom that uses a podium. And then the proverbial deep breath. As I teach my students, don't let anybody see you do it, right? Because that just looks weird and they think you're getting ready for a boxing ring or something. But it's okay for you to kind of just take a deep breath and you kind of say, okay, I got this. We're ready to start. Or whatever it is you want to tell yourself that reassures you that you are in control of the moment. You don't have to be hyper to do it, but you can be calm and you're collected and you've got this. The witness is actually wondering what you're doing and is getting kind of anxious because they've been prepped for this big cross-examination that's going to come, and you're taking 15, 20 seconds. Wait a minute, you're supposed to be jumping on me. But you've allowed yourself to relax and to get into at least the first few questions with some peacefulness before you really start jumping into your cross.
Oh, the power of the pause, right? And within the examination too, between your different head notes or your chapters, don't be afraid of that pause. It draws all the attention on you, which is great drama and engagement, and the jury is watching everything you do. So don't be afraid to take that moment and to have that pause. I think that's a great tip as far as not getting sucked into the panic or the in the moment mode. I've got to get up there and get this started right now that Cheryl's talking about.
You're both longtime NITA instructors, and I am wondering if in your teaching for us, whether it's in the classroom for NITA or in your case, Cheryl, at law school, do women have a harder time with cross-examination, do you think?
I certainly do. I think that at both extremes, the idea of being anxious about appearing aggressive, so it may kind of foster a greater degree of timidity than would be there naturally. I don't want to look like I'm being rude. I don't want it to look like I'm being domineering. And on the other end, quite frankly, I come across very domineering. I come across very controlling. And so how do I pull it down? How do you achieve that proper balance? And with some witnesses, they need the domineering. Some witnesses need to be taught that they will answer the question that is asked, not the question they want to talk about. And so you have to, I think during the course of a cross-examination, women take on many different persona. You start out nice, but you let them know you can be not nice, and then you can go back to being nice again. But you have to be aware that you're doing all of that. And that's not something we really focus on. At least my experience, women don't.
I think women attorneys worry about tone and demeanor so much more than a male attorney who's going to do a cross-examination. So I think that affects how we view cross-examination. And one thing we have to acknowledge here is that there is some bias for women in the courtroom for things like cross-examination. And sometimes that does come from an unfair place, right? A place of bias. So we need to acknowledge that. But what I would say is if you are examining your actions on cross-examination, meaning making sure that you're not being reactionary to the witness, right? We don't want to react to them. We want them reacting to us because we're in control of the examination. If you make sure it's not reactionary, then it's not emotion driving it. It's simply the point that you are trying to make, which that's, as Cheryl says, dependent on how the witness is behaving for you. Maybe they need a specific tone. Maybe the facts drive you there. But if it's a purposeful decision that this is how I am going to approach this cross-examination, or at least this portion of it, then you are conducting an effective cross-examination, and don't worry so much about the tone.
One of the things that I have seen, fortunately on rare occasions, is where a male witness will say something sexist, will say something rude, will say something insulting to the female attorney. And there's like that gasp in the courtroom, and everybody's waiting to see how she's going to handle it. Because it happens, and it happens so quickly that perhaps the judge may not have even reacted yet. And all attention is on that attorney to how are you going to excuse, reprimand, confront, how are you going to handle that? And so that's always out there as this really rare possibility, but it's one of the things you have to kind of, perhaps to some degree, anticipate.
And now we close with what else but closing argument and yet another U.S. DOJ guest. To close on closing, we have Luke Cass. He served as a senior trial attorney in the U.S. DOJ's Public Integrity Section, where he led investigations and prosecutions of elected officials, appointed officers, and career government employees. Prior to that, he served as an assistant United States attorney in the Financial Fraud and Corruption Unit for the District of Puerto Rico. He's now a partner in the White Collar Defense and Criminal Investigations Group at the D.C. office of Womble Bond Dickinson. Here's what Luke shared with us in episode 27 about closing argument.
Closing argument is the first and only time for you to argue your case to the jury. Some folks like to sprinkle their openings with argument, but a proper opening should not have any argument in it. There are subtleties in openings, but by and large, they're limited to a preview and a promise of what jurors will hear and see.
So what are the best things or the advantages for counsel during closing argument?
For both the defense and the government, closing is an opportunity to show the jury that you've delivered on what you promised during your opening. It's a culmination and a synthesis of all the testimony, the exhibits, be those documents or recordings, the law, the trust you've earned with the jurors. And at the same time, there's an element of performance to it, dramatic quality to effective summation.
Right. So on the flip side of that, what are the challenges or the difficulties of closing for counsel?
Many challenges for closings, but just a few that come to mind. First is timing. Closings often occur after a long, hard-fought battle of trial, and you're tired, but it's such a pivotal moment, and you want it to be great. So while you have the advantages of recency, that it'll be the last thing that jurors hear, there's a pressure to perform in that high wire act environment to make sure that it's effective. Second, it's an area that's a minefield of potential legal issues, particularly if you're a prosecutor, as I'll talk about a little bit later. So it's very easy to make a mistake, and there are a lot of ways to go out of bounds. And lastly, third, especially for white collar cases, an effective uh, closing needs to be a process of distillation. And by what I mean about that is you take all the emails, the bank records, the tricky legal concepts, and simplify that into a simple, persuasive narrative that jurors can understand easily. It sort of reminded me of closings remind me of Mark Twain's quote about writing, where he says, "I apologize for it being such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one." Um, to make a closing great, you need to invest a lot of time mastering the facts, the law, your delivery, and the nonverbal communication that you want to make with the jury. That nonverbal communication is often as significant as the content of the argument itself. Making eye contact, pausing at certain points, getting a good cadence and confidence are all very important. It's basically a process that starts well before trial begins.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that, Luke, because I wanted to ask you a little bit more about preparing for your closing. I know that as a federal prosecutor, it gave you a lot of experience in the courtroom and naturally pulling your case together in closing argument. So, how much of your closing do you tend to have well constructed before the trial starts versus adding it as a result of what happened during the trial?
Yeah, that's a good question. You begin thinking about it very early on, as early as when you decide how to charge a case when you're a prosecutor, and it gets improved through time. But you're absolutely thinking about it and having the skeleton of it done, and you add to it what comes up during trial in terms of the evidence, and just to make sure you're arguing facts and evidence that are actually admitted in the record, not straying beyond that.
Great. What are your thoughts on using visual aids during closing? Is that a good time for doing that?
It depends on the case. In a straightforward case, it may be somewhat distractive to a jury, but in a complex white collar case, the use of for example, a PowerPoint presentation can be very helpful, particularly if the timing of certain events is critical, because it'll allow the jury to see bank deposits being made in relation to a key phone call or a key email visually, and you can recreate steps a defendant or a key person took on a certain day in a scheme or a conspiracy. But it's not limited to white collar cases either. I had a Hobbs Act robbery case where the FBI was able to show the actual physical locations of the defendants using their cell phones just a minute or two after the robbery, which can be compelling evidence when identification's at issue.
So, jury instructions are also a part of closing. How do they fit in? And I wonder, do they kind of slow down your momentum because they're kind of boring?
Yeah, sometimes they're boring. Yeah, especially the white collar case. They're vital though, Marcy. Some judges do the jury instructions before closings occur. Most of them do them after closings, but in either instance, whether you're the government or the defense, you'll use those instructions to show the jury that the elements have been proven or why they haven't, based on the facts of the case. For the plaintiff who bears the burden of proof, they'll take each element one by one and apply it to proof that's been admitted at trial. So, for example, you'll say something like the emails in Exhibit 10 were sent from New York to California and they crossed interstate lines, which is an element of wire fraud. Or, as you heard from a representative of a particular bank, a financial institution was FDIC insured at the time of the facts at issue for a bank fraud element. For the defense, the jury instructions are equally important. Most white collar offenses require specific intent, that the defendant committed an offense knowingly or willfully. So effective closings from the defense side will laser focus on that mental state, along with the definition of reasonable doubt, and that the burden of proof rests with the government. This played out recently in the Theranos case, where the CEO, Elizabeth Holmes, was on trial in the Northern District of California. And there were a number of different wire fraud counts that the jury had to decide on, namely whether Ms. Holmes participated in a scheme to defraud, and the materiality of those statements, whatever they were, had to be significant enough that they influenced investors to invest in Theranos or use their lab services. And good faith is a defense to wire fraud, so the defense wanted a jury instruction that would allow it to argue that Miss Holmes had no intent to cheat anyone out of money. Rather, she was acting in good faith. She didn't have that intent to defraud. But whether you get the instruction or not, you can always argue it to the jury. But having the instruction is undoubtedly helpful because it gives support to the argument and allows the jury to hear from the judge rather than just the counsel.
You mentioned a little bit about how closing differs for plaintiff versus defendant. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Sure, Marcy. The basic purpose is obviously the same, to persuade the jury to reach a verdict in favor of your client, but the approaches are very different. On the defense side, it's a little bit harder. You need to anticipate a lot more because you're going second. And I like to think of the distinctions between the two as constructive versus destructive approaches. So for the plaintiff who has the burden of proof, they're showing the jury what they've built during the course of the trial. These are the elements of the offense. These are the facts that prove that. These are the reasonable inferences you can draw from the evidence and so on. So it's almost like you're building a sandcastle. And the defense's approach is different in that they're arguing there is reasonable doubt because of the interpretation of certain evidence. Defendant didn't have the requisite criminal intent to commit the offense. And these reasonable inferences in this particular case lead to reasonable doubt, essentially being that kid that kicks the sandcastle down.
Oh, got it. That's a good way of describing it, really. One difference is that plaintiff's counsel always has a chance for rebuttal after the defendant presents its argument in chief. What should we know about how to seize that moment to greatest effect?
Yeah, so rebuttal's the final word in the trial, so it's a tremendous opportunity to get that last argument in. A lot of the times it's a missed opportunity because some folks prepare it so far in advance because they want to end and go out with a bang, but seizing that moment fundamentally requires just one thing that's often overlooked, and that's listening. You want the rebuttal to actually respond to the defendant's closing. So many rebuttal arguments will miss that fundamental part of just listening and actually responding to the points that the defense raised.
Yeah, that can be kind of hard because listening requires you to be in the moment and taking your attention away from whatever you're, focused on for your own part of it.
Right. Yeah, and the trial's moving so fast, so it's difficult to just take a beat and slow down to take that point of actually listening to exactly what they're saying and driving the points to that home there.
Yeah, it's frankly true for all of us in all of our relationships.
That's right.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode on the Core 4 and discovering some of the incredible guests among our archives. You're listening to episode 80, so whether you're a longtime listener or are new to the podcast, we've got a lot more conversations for you to revisit or to listen to for the first time. The advocacy skills we discuss are evergreen. They don't have an expiration date. And it's really been our pleasure over the last 7 years to bring some of America's best trial lawyers to you through these episodes. As I mentioned, we are now on YouTube under @NITA Videos, which is one word. And of course, you can listen to us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Tune in next month when I'll be talking to Judge Christopher Witten of the Maricopa County Superior Court in Arizona and Dr. Karen Lisko of Ashurst Perkins Coie about the 12 essential elements of an assertive delivery. I'm excited to learn some new tips to incorporate into my own delivery here on the pod, so I hope you'll tune in too and we can learn together. Until then, we wish you the very best of luck in your depositions, motions, and trials. Happy lawyering! May the Record Reflect is a NITA Studio 71 production. NITA. We are advocacy enhanced, mentorship reimagined. Welcome to the community.